Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me for this FreightWaves industry update. My name is Kaylee Nix, and I am here with a pretty exciting guest today. We've got Tim Crawford joining us, the CEO over at Tenstreet. And with all eyes on the new presidential administration and what the new year could bring, we are now diving into hiring trends and what to expect from the driver market in 2025. So, Tim, thank you for joining me to talk about this pretty important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure, Kaylee. Yeah, it is super interesting times. And we'll see, what happens. It feels like we've been, as an industry, stuck in neutral for more quarters than anybody cares to think about. And we'll see what the new year brings.
Yeah, it feels like, with the recessionary pressure that we've seen on the freight market the last 2 years, we went from what was the best of times to what has been kind of the worst of times. It feels like it's been sluggish and it's just been really a tough time for drivers in the space. And
Oh, absolutely.
when we're looking at 2024 and carriers are starting to look ahead, what should they expect from the driver market in 2025, both on the high note and then also what challenges could carriers expect next year?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things we think is that we think drivers um, vote with their feet every day, right? When they decide when to go look in the market, when to think about making a move. And the average driver's on the market about 3 times a year, every 4 months. Even in like relatively weak times, we see them on the market with some regularity. Which from a driver's perspective is totally rational, right? They're trying to decide where's the best place for them to sort of take care of themselves and their family. And what we've seen throughout all of 24 is a lot of caution from drivers, right? The drivers that have the most discretion, right, are staying longer and longer at carriers, and they're being more and more careful and more diligent when they do decide to go in the job market. And I think even as the hopefully the drumbeat of good news starts to get a little louder, right, as we come into the new year around whether it's tender rejections or freight volumes, what have you, I think drivers are going to be relatively cautious. Um, and so I think that means from a carrier perspective, carriers have to be on their A game in terms of how to tell their story most effectively to drivers. Um, because I think there's going to be some convincing that needs to happen.
When it comes to you guys at 10 Street, how are you all expecting to adapt to market changes next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One, I think uh, we too are looking forward to the macro environment, the freight conditions to get a little better, right? Um, and I think part of that is we're just tired of the lackluster you know mood in the industry that we've had for the last several quarters. And so I think we're looking forward to that both for drivers and for our carriers. And I think we're looking forward in terms of continuing what we've what the steps we've taken from a product development standpoint, and trying to lean in and feel like, hey, there's going to be some more opportunities in 25 to kind of building on what the things we did in 24.
So, a lot of the last 2 years has been kind of marked by trepidation almost for drivers to either want to stay in the seats that they're currently in or be really hesitant to jump into the market, right? And find a new place to be. What are some of those key factors that will influence those decision-making processes going forward, whether that's to decide to switch carriers finally or to stay put where they're at?
Yeah, I think the and that's the $1 million question, right? What's going to make drivers, motivated enough to make a move? And I think it's going to come down to individual drivers one at a time's judgment around the prospects for that carrier that they're talking to. Um, and but that is coupled with, and I think this is really interesting, with how easy the carrier is to work with. And it when we look at the data, it's almost like the responsiveness of the carrier, the straightforwardness of the sort of how they're working with drivers is viewed as a pretty good proxy for what that carrier is going to be like after the hire. So even throughout all of 23, when you know by a lot of accounts, you would think it would be kind of a carrier's market, right? They would be able to sort of have their the upper hand in terms of drivers. And drivers, if you had miles as a carrier, you'd be able to kind of have first look at a lot of drivers. And what we see is, while that might have been true on the margins, the fundamentals around just carrier response time are still really, really important. Right? If for carriers that respond to an individual driver within 5 minutes of an application being submitted, most months that ups the odds that that driver is going to get hired by about 40%. Just being responsive. That has nothing to do with, hey, how many miles that driver is going to get. It has nothing to do with home time policies or detention time policies, any of those things. But I think drivers look at that and go, oh, that's a pretty good proxy. If you can't respond to me quickly as an individual driver, yeah, you're probably not going to be more responsive when I'm on your payroll, right? And so those sort of blocking and tackling things continue to be really important, and I think are going to be increasingly under the magnifying glass into 25 as drivers are looking at a lot of carriers deciding, okay, where should I go?
Labor needs and the pool of new talent entering the market and the pool of people who are choosing to stay in the market after maybe even a year of service are pretty constrained. And that's been a really big topic of conversation around the industry, really for the last kind of 4 years. But I think carriers are now really getting savvy to the point where they say, hey, we're having a smaller pool to have to fish from, right? We have less fish in the sea for us to put in these seats. So when it comes to looking at the number of people who are either entering or leading the driver market in 2025, do you guys have any expectations about if there could be a change in those trends, if we'll see more entrants or if we'll see more exits?
I think that's a great question, and we don't have a perfect crystal ball by any means. Our sense is that the level of exits is going to moderate a bit, right? As I think as more freight's available and pay packages, trend up with with mileage, right? I think the attractiveness somewhere else is going to go down relative to trucking. So I think my hope is that we're going to see fewer exits. The entrance, I think, is a tougher one. And I think a lot of it has to do with, what happens with, interest rates and tariffs, right? That can really move the needle quite a bit in sort of the employment markets adjacent to trucking, right? Construction, manufacturing, those sorts of things, and whether that's more attractive or not relative to trucking. So I think time will tell. But it feels largely, I think those things from an individual carrier's perspective are going to be on the margins. I think the fundamentals are going to be, those trends are going to make themselves felt over the longer term, over a 3 to 5 year period, and are not going to be sort of the dominant story of people filling their orientation class in 25.
So we're really starting to see these green shoots in the market. We're starting to see some rate recovery. We're starting to see more freight entering the market and hopefully finally some turnaround of this very shipper held power kind of back into equilibrium. If not, we're not over to the carrier side yet, but we're getting closer to that equilibrium, right? What will help carriers be successful next year as they aim to keep their trucks on the road while they're continuing to gain momentum back on their side of the coin?
Yeah, I think as things continue down that path, I think the ability for carriers to both attract good drivers, and that is, in our view, a lot around speed and around being easy to do business with, right? That's on the one hand, and then at the same time though, making sure that once drivers are onboarded, that carriers are deliberative and intentional around driver retention, right? Making sure that all those promises that were made during the recruiting process are made good, right? That's going to become more important, because what will happen is, as sort of that rising tide is lifting all boats, the carriers that aren't making good on promises they made during that recruiting process are going to face a lot of competition from, drivers are going to have options of where they go. right? And so I think there's going to be an increased premium on retention. Whereas in today's market, what we're seeing is drivers may not be happy with the carrier they're at today, um, but they're pretty convinced the grass isn't greener on the other side of the fence, right? And so they've been a lot more cautious, and we can absolutely see that in the data. Drivers are being more cautious than they've been in a really, really long time right now, and we look to see that relax as those shoots develop.
Last question for you, Tim, and it's everybody's favorite buzzword to toss around: AI, artificial intelligence. And from a freight tech standpoint, it's of course here and we're seeing it more and more. But from a driver standpoint, I think it's still kind of insulated a little bit from the reaches of this increasing technology. But when you're looking at AI in 2025, how much is it going to have an effect in your industry? Is it something to watch out for? Is it a little overhyped, or is it just not a concern?
Yeah, I think we introduced our first AI products, first generative AI products in 24. And we have several more sort of in the labs that we're planning on releasing later this year, early next year. Um, and, one of the things that we believe is that if you target AI at eliminating or reducing human connections, it feels overhyped, right? Where drivers go and where drivers stay, um, nobody looks at like a future employer and said, "Oh, I really wish my relationship with that future employer was like the self-checkout stand of Target." Right? Nobody looks at that from a driver's perspective, right? They're all trying to make that human connection. And I think that's 100% natural, 100% right. And so AI in as an enabler of those human connections, we think is really promising. Um, our perspective, we have data on interactions from millions of drivers and tens of thousands of recruiters, and our real focus is, hey, how do we take that corpus of data, and how do we do something to help make those connections richer, make those connections easier to make, not try to eliminate those human connections. Right? We don't think that's going to end up with a win for the driver or wins for the carrier.
I love that. Once you get that human connection, it gives us a little bit more of an opportunity to create those wins all around. And Tim, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about Tenstreet and what you guys are looking forward to in 2025. For folks who want to reach out to you, maybe wrap up some loose ends as we head into the holiday season and take that like 2 weeks that Christmas and New Year's gets everybody the time off. Where can people go to do that?
Oh, fantastic. I mean, I think, and absolutely my pleasure, as always. I really appreciate the time. Happy to, anybody's got any follow-up questions, connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to engage and provide any help we can.
All right, Tim, thank you so much again for joining us today. And thank you all for sticking with us for this FreightWaves industry insight. Have a great day, and we will see you next time.